Welcome back to Pellets for Politics, a show where we take the complexity out of politics and make it palatable for you. With me, your host, TJ Maslela. Welcome to the show. Today's episode, we've got a special guest, a man who needs no introduction, who's been in government for donkey years, but is still relatively young. Former Minister of Finance, Public Enterprise, Home Affairs, Mr. Malusi Gigaba. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
So, fine, I know we said you don't need any introduction, but how would you introduce yourself? How would you walk people as to who you are, how you got to be Minister of everything?
Look, introduction is important because you must never presume that anybody knows you. It also is a good mindset which helps to ground you in humility.
Okay.
So I'm Malusi Gigaba. I'm from KwaZulu-Natal. My mother was a nurse. My dad was a priest. I went to school in KZN, graduated up to master's level. I started politics in the mid-80s, but became much more active towards the end of the 80s, going into the early 90s, joined the ANC in 1990. I will cut the long story short. I'm a former president of the ANC Youth League for 3 consecutive terms. I served 8 years as president of the ANC Youth League. And then I moved into government. I was Deputy Minister of Home Affairs for 6 years. Then I became Minister of Public Enterprises in 2010, Minister of Home Affairs in 2014, Minister of Finance in 2017, and then I went back to Home Affairs in 2018 and resigned in November 2018. That's who I am.
And you're how old? Just context, because this...
I'm 52 now.
And your first deputy minister, you were how old when you started?
I was 33.
Okay. Now, on that now, because you were youth when you got in.
Yes.
There has been a, let's say, a downward take of interest of youth in politics, and also on the other side of youth being given the opportunity in politics. Why do you think that is, and how do you think we get back there?
Look, in as much as that might be the case, the South African youth are very politically conscious. They may not be politically active, but they're politically conscious. They've got opinions about politics, and they voice those opinions about all manner of things, be it political parties, and the functioning of government, particularly at national level. South Africans are very much keen and active in national government, national political, at the national political level. And they have opinions even about global issues. So you see a lot of them expressing their sympathy with Palestine because they actually appreciate the struggles of the Palestinian people and the suffering of the Palestinian people. You see a lot of them expressing sympathies with West Africa, given the political changes that have been brewing in that part of the continent's region, and they are prone towards progressive ideas on the African continent. So young people are conscious. Now, in terms of political activism, you will understand that because of the political changes which have taken place in the country, a lot of young people now have various arenas of activity. In the past, when we joined politics, it was probably the only option that we had, because the urgent question of the day was the defeat of the apartheid system. But youth today have got a plethora of options available to them: sport, culture, music, politics, professions, and so on. And so they are active in all of those spheres. What we need to do is to rebuild. And the reason why you have seen a decline in political activism is because of the weaknesses that have been accumulating among particularly the youth political organizations, and including students' organizations. And that's what we need to focus on, because we need to rebuild the organizational, the political organizations of young people, give them a voice, ensure that they are not encumbered or mortgaged to powerful political figures, so that they are able at all times to articulate the interests of young people, not to articulate the interests of the powerful political figures and represent those interests among young people. Because if they fail to represent as robustly as possible the interests of young people also begin to lose interest in organized political activism. And you then see the decline at that level. And I think that is the fundamental issue we need to do. But there's also been an increasing discrepancy, an increasing social distance between political leaders and the masses of the people in the country. The livelihoods of political leaders seem to be above those of the ordinary people. They seem to be aloof, and ordinary people feel that they are not really represented by all political parties across the board. That is the issue we need to address. And together with that social distance is the growing distrust of political leaders, of religious leaders, of people in authority. That is the issue that we need to address, so that we get South Africans actively involved in shaping their own lives across the board.
Okay. Now, part of the outcourse, or a lot of views have come out with regards to the first ministry you held, which was public enterprise. One, from your time there, and two, post. Do you think that it's a department we need, or is it something that we could do away with?
It's a department that is absolutely necessary. I think the biggest problem has been at a macro policy level. The absence of a global, when I say global, I don't mean the globe, I'm talking about the country. The absence of a macro political and policy perspective as to the Department of Public Enterprises, its mandate, the contribution of public enterprises in the country, the management and governance of public enterprises, so that we can optimize.
Can you also just go as to the mandate of the, for context, mandate of the public enterprise?
The mandate of state-owned enterprises. We need to clarify the mandate of state-owned enterprises, because most of the state-owned enterprises that we have in the country were established during the colonial and apartheid period. And those mandates have not been changed post-apartheid. Now, and yet the new government has got a different mission from that of the apartheid system. The governance framework that exists in the country is not a macro governance framework. So you would find state-owned enterprises existing in different government departments. The problem that creates is that in some instances, so you have the Department of Public Enterprises responsible for about 7 SOEs. Its portfolio includes about 7 SOEs. They could be lesser now with the privatization of SAA and the dissolution of South African Express. Now, the problem with that is that because best practice in terms of SOE governance exists in the Department of Public Enterprises, in terms of the admin capacity, in other government departments, they've got disparate, divergent forms of governance. And that creates a disparity in terms of the governance of SOEs and how they are managed, how their mandates are being pursued. On top of that, there are different legislations existing in the country in terms of state-owned enterprises. There is no single macro framework for state-owned enterprises, which then creates this problem of confusion as to the mandates of these SOEs and what they need to do. So the Department of Public Enterprises is necessary in the sense that all your commercial enterprises ought to belong there, so that you separate the governance of SOEs and the execution of the policy mandate of government from the formulation of policy and the regulatory function. Because if you take all these SOEs that are at DPE and send them to the policy departments, you are going to have a contradiction in terms of the formulation of policy, the regulation of SOEs, as well as, the formulation of sector policy, okay, the regulation of these SOEs, as well as the execution of those policies. It is international best practice that those three functions must not belong in the same department. So if you look at the frameworks that the OECD has created, how China, for example, Norway, and other countries are executing their SOE mandate, they have sector departments that formulate policies and regulations, but they have a separate entity responsible for the governance and oversight of SOEs in pursuit of the policies that have been formulated at government level.
Principally, that makes sense. I don't think one can argue with the logic. It makes sense. But if one looks at, example, your Transnet, I believe that is a setup where policy is Department of Transport, but the running is with public enterprise. But it seems like we've struggled to get it right, which raises the question that all of us as viewers, and I guess even some within government, the capacity of government to run SOEs. What's gone wrong there?
There is no, the problem in that regard is not with regard to the separation of the functions. The problem is with regard to the absence of an overarching framework, as I say. And the contradictions and tensions which often happen when the sector policy is being formulated, which would have an impact on an entity and could undermine its balance sheet, could undermine its mandate functions, and could undermine its governance framework. So you have, for example, you've had in the past tensions at the level of the rail policy, which is being formulated by the Department of Transport, which would undermine freight rail that is being executed by Transnet. You would have a tension with regard to the port policy, which would have advocated for part privatization or even whole privatization of the port authority, when in actual fact the port authority and freight rail are the cash cows for Transnet. They make Transnet to be viable. So you need to resolve the tensions that exist at policy level. You've had tensions in the past with regard to the open skies policy of the Department of Transport. I'm sure the Department of Transport would say to you that no, the open skies policy has worked well. South Africa has a variety of airlines that are flying on our skies. The end result of that has been the complete destruction of South African Airways as a national champion and flag carrier of the country. So you need to resolve those tensions so that you don't undermine your entities through the sector policies that you formulate. The same tensions would happen at the level of energy, which would impact on ESCOM. Now, that requires careful management of policy formulation at the level of government to ensure that you iron out all the tensions. Because if government doesn't have a common policy framework with regard to the existence of SOEs, then you will see that expressed in the formulation of policies that undermines the SOEs. And that has been the problem in our country, because from 1994, when the ANC took government over, prior to 1994, the National Party had discussed a policy to privatize SOEs. So the Department of Public Enterprises in 1994 was known as the Office for Privatization. The new government made it the Department of Public Enterprises, but there has been a tentative approach towards privatization to an extent that ESCOM in 1994 was told not to invest in new generation capacity. The end result was this load shedding we're experiencing because there has been no sufficient capacity and no long-term planning at the level of ESCOM and build program for new generation stations which would have supplied the country. We took a wrong view that ESCOM had overcapacity, but it only had overcapacity in relation to the white minority. That did not take into consideration millions of black South Africans who had no electricity. So when you change the mandate of ESCOM and say, electrify the country, but you were busy closing down power stations, mothballing them, you were not building new capacity. So we had to face a generation dilemma, a generation crisis, a supply crisis in over a period of time, which started in 2007. So I'm saying that the problem of SOEs doesn't stem from the separation of the entity from the sector department, but it stems from the absence of an overarching policy that gives direction to the mandates of these SOEs and the objectives which you are setting them, the governance framework, so that you reconcile your PFMA, your King Code, and all your other governance framework, and have a common governance framework for your SOEs in the manner that the Chinese have done.
Okay. With that said, the natural question would be, from your time then, what would you say have been your successes and challenges, if you were to summarize that?
You know, I didn't have much time at DPE, and that's part of the problem in the country. When I became Minister of Public Enterprises in 2010, I was the fourth minister for the department in 2 years. From 2008 to 2010, there were 4 ministers of public enterprises. So as I came in, there was a lot of policy uncertainty, there was a lot of challenges that the entities were facing. But be that as it may, in 2004, government had decided to pull back from the gear approach of privatizing SOEs when Minister Ewin had announced that ESCOM and Transnet and other SOEs would remain under government ownership, and that their mandate would include developmental mandates, objectives such as industrialization, black economic empowerment, and providing supply. So we focused on that, ensuring that the SOEs, we stabilized the governance of SOEs. When I came in, ESCOM had a board which had been in office for longer than 9 years. Now that is irregular for an entity to have a board that has existed for more than 9 years. So we had to stabilize the governance. There was no board at Transnet. There was an interim board that kept on being renewed every year. Entities like SAA also had not been stabilized. So we had to stabilize governance. We had to provide a clear mandate with regard to governance, with regard to their social non-commercial objectives, and with regard to their commercial objectives. We focused at Transnet and Eskom on how they would be able to provide support to industrial players that depended on them. That included renewing the rail lines, ensuring efficiency in terms of the rail lines, especially the export lines, ensuring efficiencies at the ports, and that's part of the reason why new cranes were procured at various ports in Durban, Cape Town, in Nelson Mandela Bay, in Kucha, and so on. So we focused on those things. We focused on skills development.
Now to Home Affairs. Yes, so I guess there's an issue there that was there long before you and is still there long after you. The border control and the challenge we've had with dealing with immigration, illegal immigration in particular. What's gone wrong? What's gone wrong? What's been so hard about saying, there's the border, you guys that side, us here, that's the entry, that's the exit? Where have we gone wrong, and what's hard about fixing that?
What's hard about fixing it, first and foremost, are resource constraints that the Department of Home Affairs is confronted with. It doesn't have enough immigration officers. They're just simply not enough. And for the Department of Home Affairs to implement what, let me call it narrowly, border control, it would need to rely on the National Defence Force as well as the police. But the mandate of the police is crime prevention. So border management is not their mandate. The National Defence Force is ill-equipped to manage border control, and so you've needed to have sufficient capacity. The Border Management Authority, which has now been created, was intended to resolve that problem, to take over the responsibility of managing our borders, ensuring that the border line, the border fence is recreated, that people are encouraged. So with immigration, the purpose is not to stop people from coming to South Africa. We're not an island. That's not the purpose. The purpose is to encourage our neighbors and people from afar to enter South Africa through ports of entry, present themselves properly, submit their documents, and ensure that they enter the country. But even our ports of entry are ill-equipped in terms of technology. We don't even have scanning machines, the big scanning machines for trucks and for big vehicles. When it's public holidays, you see an increase, a drastic increase of traffic at our ports of entry. You've got OR Tambo International Airport, which is our biggest port of entry. You've got Bridge, which is the biggest land port of entry by far, second only to OR Tambo, which is an airport. And then you've got 6 others in addition to Bridge, which are equally very busy. Your Maseru, your Kopfontein, Oshhoek, and so on. They are very, very ill-equipped and undercapacitated. There isn't an integrated approach to border management. So there's a problem of resources, but the biggest problem is the lack of a border management approach, which is all-inclusive of all government departments responsible for such, so that we all know who does what and who is the lead agent at our ports of entry. So the Border Management Authority tries to resolve that, but it's going to take time before South Africans realize the benefit of the Border Management Authority. But it's a good thing that it's now there. And the third problem has been the approach just to immigration management, which is based on repulsion of immigration and inability to link migrants to South Africa's economic development and security. And that is where the issues of documentation of people comes in, and the encouragement of people to enter the country in order to benefit the South African economy. Be that as critical skills, but most importantly, if you look at the contribution of our neighboring countries to South Africa, you take Botswana, you take people from Eswatini, people from Zimbabwe, people from Lesotho. They come to buy bulk goods and go back to sell in their countries. Encourage that and guide it so that there are no loopholes along the line. And those who are coming here for genuine intentions are able to do so in a seamless manner without hurdles. And those who are coming into the country for crime then are able to be dealt with by the relevant authorities, which include now the BMA and the police.
You spoke about the economic impact, and we see it, whether it's at a restaurant, barbershop, etc., where the majority of workers there are foreign, being exploited. There was a policy that you were working on in your time as Home Affairs. What was that policy, and can you briefly walk us through it?
The policy, in actual fact, already existed.
Okay.
It just needs execution. The policy is that you must not, in the country, you must have a quota of immigrants that are allowed to work in all the sectors. The problem we were experiencing is that, particularly in retail, hospitality, construction, agriculture, the employers prefer employing immigrants because they cannot be unionized, and therefore they can afford not to pay them a living wage. And that undermines South Africans, it undermines the unions. And so what we were trying to do is to enforce the implementation of that legislation. The immediate problem we confronted was the inability, the incapacity of Home Affairs. As I said earlier, Home Affairs doesn't have enough immigration officers and immigration inspectors who can go into restaurants, go into the shopping malls, go to farms to inspect and ensure compliance with that legislation. For them to do that, they need the Department of Labor, the Department of Agriculture, and various other government departments, including the police, to assist them with that enforcement. Because particularly if you go to the farms, the farmers tend to be very aggressive, hostile, and violent. And so an immigration officer who is unarmed is unable to approach a farm and talk to the farmer about enforcement of this legislation. So you need these other government departments, but the police would tell you that, hey, we are also undercapacitated and we have got a high crime rate in the country, we can't assist you there. The Border Management Authority hopefully will assist in that regard, even though by taking over the functions of immigration officers along the borderline and at the ports of entry, to release more immigration officers to focus on enforcement and inspection. But one of the things you then need to do is to introduce technology at our ports of entry. The e-gates, the e-passports, all of those functions that make port management to be seamless, to be smooth, and to be corruption-free, which would then enable the immigration officers to step back from there and focus on these other areas that require inspection. I'm not sure how far they are in that regard, but I hope that that policy can still be implemented with due regard to not sounding Afrophobic and xenophobic. Because sometimes some of the sentiments that you hear, even from some government officials, actually do sound Afrophobic. And yet we can manage issues such as the Zamazamas, we can manage undocumented migration in a manner that is considerate of the fact that you are not trying to encourage your citizens to take a hostile view towards African immigrants, because there is a tendency to view every African immigrant as undocumented and therefore to dub them illegal, when in actual fact many would have come into the country through proper documentation and they are here for genuine reasons.
Okay. Now moving to your stint in finance, which was also short.
11 months.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Thanks for the time. But one of the issues I don't know if it's me, maybe I'm speculating, but during your time, or shortly just before and shortly after, there was a strong stakeholder in the form of rating agencies. Can you walk us through that? Or what's the importance of the rating agencies, one on us, and yeah, let's start there.
Ratings agencies were... South Africa entered into an agreement with the ratings agencies after 1994 as a way of getting South Africa internationally recognized as an investment destination. Now, the idea was that if ratings agencies such as Fitch, Standard & Poor's, Moody's, including there's another one, an Asian one, if they rate you AAA plus, then you are open for investments, you are an investment destination. Now, if you drop from there, depending on the rating, you could still be an investment destination, but once you are declared junk status, you are an investment destination, but the investors take a dim view of your country depending on the issues that the ratings agencies would be raising with you. And that's what we were managing at the time, because there was a lot of politics. My view of the ratings agencies is that they are as political as anyone. So they would rate South Africa less than a European country facing a far worse situation than we do. Sometimes depending on the fact that we are a developing country, but sometimes depending on the fact that they've taken a dim view of a sitting president. I think President Zuma was dealt harshly when by the ratings agencies and was dealt politically. They were biased towards him, even though the management of the economy at the time was not bad, and you needed, when you engaged with them, you would present to them that this is what we're doing. In terms of the issues that you say you are concerned about, issues of nuclear, issues of the budget, the prudent management of the economy. The government was not taking abrupt decisions, and in actual fact had a very solid infrastructure development plan which was aimed at driving investments into the economy and driving demand in the economy. So the ratings agencies are political, they are biased, and we should understand them as such, in as much as they can play a positive role. You will be struck by their silence on certain issues which would be of grave concern. Back in 2017, they literally lived in South Africa. We had to talk to them almost daily to reassure them, even on issues that were really completely unjustified, and where you would say to them, but this is a matter of national sovereignty, why are you interfering? But they would be here interfering, trying to drive a particular direction in terms of policy. And we would say to them, no, your job is not to tell us which policies to implement, including on issues of nuclear. Your job is to ask us how we are dealing with this. Because even if we were to say we are beginning to invest in nuclear build, their job would have been, how are you going to do that? Would have been to ask us, how are you going to do that without impacting the country's economy, increasing the debt in an unsustainable manner, and so on. But even then, you know, you can increase your debt, your sovereign debt to GDP, if you have a solid growth plan. So even as the debt grows, you know that these are the sectors where you are going to be driving the growth so that it mitigates against the rising debt. If you are industrializing your economy and ensuring that the debt is not an upset debt that is irresponsible.
Do we have one of our own African rating agencies? If not, why wouldn't we have done that by now?
No, we don't have an African rating agency. But BRICS has been discussing establishing its own rating agency, and we were supportive of that initiative because it would give us, particularly among BRICS countries, a different approach. We thought that a BRICS-based rating agency such as would exist would then encourage BRICS nationals to view each other's countries differently. I think it's even more important now, given the fact that about 6 new countries have joined BRICS. And so you have, and these are big economies, Saudi, Iran, Egypt, these are big economies. They are going to give BRICS a serious voice in global politics and in terms of global GDP. And most of these countries are production centers. If you look at China, India, Brazil, if you look at Russia itself, and they're also oil producing and exporting countries. And they've got large volumes of energy in terms of oil, gas, electricity. So you are talking about countries that even in terms of logistics are big. That is going to be a massive plus for BRICS ministers of finance to initiate a BRICS ratings agency that is going to compete with the other ratings agencies. At the level of Africa, it's important but still difficult given the low levels of growth and the weak economies of the continent. But I think African heads of state ought to be discussing this because the African population is growing. You've got the ACFTA, the Africa Continental Trade Agreement, which is a huge region, trade area. And because of that and the fact that for quite a long time, Sub-Saharan Africa was leading the world economy in terms of growth, even though it has subsided. You've got a growing population in Africa. You need to look at how you are going to positively position the African continent in terms of articulating perceptions about itself. And perhaps such a rating agency, among others, would assist us to attract investments from within the African continent, investments from outside into Africa, and encourage different countries to stabilize politically and economically and begin to move towards democracy.
You know, when you were raising the issue of rating agencies and investors, it reminded me of one of our previous engagements where you were reading the book, The Economic Hitman by John Perkins. Yeah. Without creating any controversy, I'm not trying to do any of that. Is such true? Is it a real thing? Has Africa have been subjected to economic hitmen from your experience?
Yes, many African countries have been subjected to economic hitmen.
And us?
The imperialist role of the United States is very destructive on the economies of developing countries. They have deployed such economic hitmen in Iran, in Latin America, and even in Africa, and destabilized the economies of these countries in their own interests, for their own benefit. We in South Africa, I think we could discuss, you need to look at what John Perkins says about the role of economic hitmen in terms of usurping your energy policy, causing destruction to your SOEs, causing those SOEs to be privatized, taking over your energy, logistics, and port capacity, providing economic projections in terms of energy in particular and your economic growth potential that is going to lead to them, that is going to lead to your country implementing privatization, bringing in American companies, ensuring that they create a cohort of economic and political elites that are intermeshed, that are enmeshed, that are going to drive in collaboration your country's economy towards their direction. Now, I would then leave it there. I would say, look at where we are now. Look at the amount of loans we've taken from the US in terms of the just energy transition. Look at how we have been advised that we need to do away with fossil fuels, using coal to produce electricity, that we must focus on renewable energy, which destroys our mining sector, which creates instability in the mining sector, which destroys jobs in the mining sector, which destroys the capacity of ESCOM to generate baseload electricity. I worry that even with all the renewable energy investment that has come in, the question that we now need to probe very closely is who owns the technology, who owns the intellectual property, who owns the investment resource into those sectors. How much of that is going to benefit the country and remain in the country? And what destruction has been caused to our mining sector in terms of production, productivity, when we have been exporting our coal to Europe instead of using it, and what's going to be the impact on South Africa in the medium to long term in terms of our energy security, because we have not really been building sufficient baseload generation that is going to do away with load shedding on a sustainable basis in the country over the coming period. And therefore the question would be, are we not going to be saddled with load shedding for a longer time than we imagine? I think these are questions that we ought to be engaging with, because if we don't do that, we will find ourselves as a country unable to become industrial because we don't have sufficient energy to supply industries. One of the reasons why ESCOM was established first in 1922 through the legislation, and then in the 1930s through buying the Victoria Falls Power Company, was to ensure that the country generated its own electricity, supplied its own industry, did not rely on the mining sector that was foreign owned for the supply of electricity, and therefore could be able to impact positively in terms of developmental policies of the mining sector and other sectors of the economy so that it can industrialize and develop. And we might lose that capacity if we continue to break Eskom down in the manner that we seem to have been doing in the recent past.
Guys, you heard it for yourselves. Thank you to our guest for the insight, education. We hope that you're going to be coming back, educating us further. And yeah. So for more insights, follow, like, share, links below. Thank you for coming through.
It's my pleasure.